Hello, welcome to Airtime. Now, this is our opportunity to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the big news stories that are appearing on our programmes at the moment. One of the compromises when you put a news programme together is that you're always very constrained on time. So this is our chance to really cut loose, get under the skin of some of the big stories and talk a little bit more about them. And today's story that we're going to look at is that of Shamima Begum, the former Bethnal Green schoolgirl who went to join ISIS. And with me is our security editor, Rohit Kachroo. OK, so let's have a look at a clip.
I'd come here with a copy of the letter sent to her parents yesterday, stripping her of British citizenship.
Please find enclosed papers that relate to a decision taken by the Home Secretary to deprive your daughter Shamima Begum of her British citizenship.
What do you think?
I don't know what to say. I'm not that shocked, but I'm a bit shocked. I don't know why my case is any different to other people. Or is it just because I was on the news 4 years ago?
And our reporter there obviously was our security editor, Rohit Kachroo. Thanks for sparing the time to talk about this. It was an amazing story, wasn't it? It still is. What is it about the Shamima Begum story that inspires people, it captures people's imagination, if you like?
Well, I guess let's remember that she didn't go out to Syria on her own like so many other British nationals did. She went as part of this group of 3 schoolgirls, 15 years old, from East London, who had skipped home, skipped school during the half-term break in February 4 years ago.
And we covered it at the time.
We covered it extensively at the time, and we also covered the responses of their families. I remember a few days later they gave this this truly emotional news conference in which they pleaded, some of them holding the sort of old teddy bears and belongings of their kids, their siblings, pleading for these 3 girls to come home. And I think it was really the age of these girls, the fact that they had done this without their parents' knowledge, and the fact that they had managed to slip away from home during the half-term break, that gave so much media profile to their case. A couple of years ago, we revealed that one of those 3 girls had been killed in Syria. And
in an airstrike, wasn't it?
That's right. And so look, we knew that there were two of these girls who were still alive. And this was in the final few weeks of the so-called caliphate. And the Times had managed to locate Shamima Begum inside one of the camps, and other journalists had interviewed her. You know, Quentin Somerville from the BBC and John Sparks from Sky. You know, these conducted these really interesting interviews with Shamima Begum. What we had done, though, was to reveal the fact that she had been stripped of her citizenship. We got hold of the letter which had been sent to her family, which really broke this news to her. And so we set about trying not only to find Shamima Begum, but to share this information with her.
She'd seen that letter for the first time when you handed it to her.
This was the moment that she realised what was happening. And, you know, what many people asked was, you know, what her response was like. And really, I think the most interesting thing was how unfazed she was by the whole thing.
Well, apparently. I mean, do you think she really was as unmoved by it as she appeared? Because, well, I mean, I'll tell you why, because somebody, another one of our reporters said to me that she almost displays the classic symptoms of an abused woman, an abused child, you know, arguably. All emotions shut down and so on. Do you see that?
I mean, it's possible, and, you know, there are very sort of black and white terms which are used to describe a lot of the people who go out to join ISIS. I mean, the thing to remember in this case is not only was she 15 years old when she travelled out there, but she had just a couple of days beforehand given birth to a child inside the camp, you know, and we were inside that camp for a very short period of time, but what we could see were the truly terrible conditions inside there. You know, they weren't the worst conditions I've seen in a refugee camp. You know, I've seen worse in East Africa, for example, but the reality here was that this was a camp that was growing by several hundred every single day, and that everyone inside there was not, you know, villagers who had relocated because of starvation or drought, or precisely, these were people who were fleeing or leaving, choosing to leave ISIS. These were people who in many cases were forced to leave, who wanted to remain, but decided to leave in order to save their lives. And so, of course, not only are the physical conditions very different to other refugee camps, but the sort of social conditions are very different as well.
Because there's that lack of sympathy, isn't there,
Yeah.
frankly, and indeed a danger with them, because who knows what they might do, because
Absolutely.
we know what they have done in the past.
Absolutely. But in this case, here was someone who was remarkably unfazed by our presence there. She at no point asked which organisation we were from or where this interview was going to be aired. She did consent to the interview several times. She wanted to get her message across. But what really struck me was how unfazed she was, how in control she seemed to be.
Of her emotions.
But also, this was somebody who, she is not stupid. Here is she had been a straight A student. And, I could see her mind working. So, for example, it just took a few minutes after presenting her with that letter before she was already calculating future options. She talked about perhaps trying to move to the Netherlands because her husband is Dutch. It didn't take a great deal of time before she was already calculating what her next options might be. So the impression I got from her is someone who is incredibly smart, who was in control, but someone who is also a 19-year-old woman. Yes, she is smart. Perhaps she is academically smart, but what was clear was that she was slightly vague when she talked about her regret. In other interviews, she said that she had no regrets. She said in this interview that actually, she did indeed have regrets. And
so her, in a sense, her response was evolving, wasn't it? As she got a sense of perhaps some of the feedback she was getting from
absolutely.
the UK.
But one important thing to really to really recognise here is that she is not inside that camp, or she was not inside that camp sitting on Twitter looking at the internet. This is somewhere where there is no phone signal, and she said that the only information that she was getting was what was coming from the small number of journalists who had come in from the outside to interview her. I mean, she was getting a great deal of focus here in the UK, but when you go to that camp, what you realise that she is one of several thousand people in a very similar situation. And so, the Kurdish authorities, the Kurdish officials who are running that camp, they're not providing her, I suspect, with daily updates any more so than they would anyone else. I mean, their real interest and their interest in behind their decision to make these interviews happen was the fact that, frankly, they want to get rid of these foreign nationals. They want the UK to take back its citizens. They want every foreign country that has got people inside that camp, people who they are paying for, who they are looking after, to take their citizens back. And so that is really what motivates that interview. That's why it was allowed to happen. It's what motivates so many of these interviews as well, Mary.
Shamima Begum said, didn't she, that she actually regretted having spoken to the press at all, having spoken to the media, because of this kickback that she was getting. She became aware very quickly, once she'd read that her citizenship was going to be revoked and so on. She realised that she might have made a false move here, a bad decision.
Yeah, and she's a relatively astute person. I mean, she said in that clip that we played earlier, did this happen to me, as in, was her citizenship stripped of her because she had been in the newspapers a few years ago? That struck me as a fairly astute observation of someone who was connecting their personal situation with the media storm that had surrounded them, and was trying to kind of analyse this almost as if she was sitting outside of the case. But yeah, I mean, she's had perhaps more attention, and that really is a fact that she was really one of the faces of this story that has gone on for now 4 or 5 years of British citizens travelling out to Syria, travelling out to Iraq to join Islamic State group. I mean, she is in contrast really to many of the men who we know or suspect to have been fighters she says that she wasn't.
She's very careful to say, I was just a housewife.
Absolutely, absolutely. As many of the women who we've interviewed have said as well, and some of the men too. But yeah, I mean, I found her sort of control, her astuteness, to be the sort of abiding characteristics from our interview, which lasted perhaps 15 minutes.
There was such a lot of press coverage of her appearance on television, and a lot of people discussing why it was that she didn't provoke feelings of sympathy. And there was one really interesting article I read where it said she didn't cry, and she didn't beg, and she didn't look vulnerable. And that had she might have garnered a bit more sympathy. What are your thoughts
Absolutely.
on that?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean,
She seemed defiant, didn't she, in a way?
She seemed defiant, yeah. I mean, let's remember, this is a woman who, as a teenager, travelled thousands of miles behind her family's back with her mates from class. She should have been from Bethnal Green,
really.
and she should have been studying for her exams. And this is not sort of meek stuff. So she has already demonstrated a great deal of defiance, of mental strength as well, in order to get that far. And in doing so, she has also survived. She has done what one of her two school friends didn't do, and survived this. So, I mean, perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised that she is defiant, that she is strong. But what's really clear here, and from what I could see on social media in response to this story, is how public perceptions are really shaped in part by the way that these interviewees respond.
Yeah.
The level of regret that they demonstrate, and
Which could be incredibly superficial.
it could be, yeah. It could be. I mean, it absolutely. I mean, but I suspect that public perception hasn't been helped by what appears to be a reluctance to show a sort of level of emotional regret that some other people who've given interviews have done.
Almost nonchalant when you said to her, "Oh, what do you think?" Having read that, and she went, "I'm not surprised."
Yeah, but
Amazing.
there are a few things to bear in mind there. Firstly, she was quite ill. She had a bad cold. She
Had just given birth.
She had just given birth, and she, it's hard to judge from someone you have never met before, but she claimed not to be feeling 100%. And so perhaps that shaped some of her responses. But in many senses, I really felt that this was like a snarky teenager. This was somebody who thought they were right, was determined that they were right, and wanted to show that they were correct.
And I think anyone with a parent of a teenage daughter would see some
Precisely,
familiarities there.
And what's really interesting is how many people said, God, what an alien case this was. I can't imagine what is going on there, and what her family must be going through. But many of those same people also said, but there was a bit of her that I recognised from my child or my younger sibling or whatever. And here are people who have been living largely with people of their own age. One of the great differences between her life back home in East London is that there is at least one generation almost missing.
Yeah.
These are largely people in their late teens, in their 20s, in their 30s, and their kids.
So there are no elders there, are there?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And so,
I mean, she was married within 5 minutes of arriving there, wasn't she, at the age of 50?
Yeah, but this is a millennial world that
Yeah.
they've been occupying for several years. And so, it's in terms of understanding the psychology that might have shaped some of those responses. I mean, they're important things. They're not excuses for anything, clearly, but they're perhaps important things to bear in mind, to try and explain why somebody might act in a way that seems not to fit with their own objectives.
Yeah.
But there have been other people who have given interviews talking fully about their regret, and the response on social media similarly has been, well, they say that, but they're lying. And so, but no, it's interesting to see how public opinion has been really shaped. You know, we can sort of see from the responses on our websites and our social media platforms that there is a great deal of interest in this case, and she has become this compelling character, not just because of the way she went out there, but what she has said since she has been inside that camp.
Yeah, fascinating. Do we know where she is now?
We think she's in one of the camps. She had been in hospital after her child died. What appears to be happening is that she's no longer wanting to give interviews, which is why we haven't seen her recently. But in terms of, you know, there have been, you know, there's a sort of legal attempt back here in the UK to try and challenge the decision made by the Home Secretary to strip her of her citizenship. We will have to see how that goes. But for now, she's out there in that camp, and she's obviously not alone. There are dozens and dozens of British men, British women, British children, or former British men, former British women who are in that camp who want to come back to the UK, but as it stands now, have no chance.
Yeah. Of course, the other former Briton, well, he's still British at the moment, is Jack Letts, so-called Jihadi Jack, who you also interviewed out there. Let's take a look at a clip of that, and then let's talk.
Miss my mum. That sounds a bit toddlerish, but in 2 years, 5 years I haven't seen my mum. 2 years I haven't spoken to my mum. I miss my mum. Even I can just see my, I'd like just a phone call. I don't know if Britain can do that for me here, but I'd like just a phone call to my mum. It's been 2 years. If I can make any requests, I'm probably not in a position to make requests, but hey, that's it all really. Miss my mum. What else do I miss? I miss pasties. It's not very English, it's sort of Scottish, isn't it? So I miss pasties. And Doctor Who. Sounds a bit stupid. That's all.
He comes across as incredibly naive. I know this is one we have to be slightly careful of for legal reasons, so, you know, there will be things that you can't go into, but is he as naive as he seems?
It's an impossible question to answer, I guess. We had much longer with Jack Letts than we did have with Shamima Begum, perhaps for 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. And at points he seemed incredibly naive. You know,
had you gone out to find him, or was he presented to you?
Well, we had, the way this works is that
and let's talk about how it works. Come on.
Yeah, so we had made requests over the course of several months to interview various British nationals who we knew to have been in Kurdish custody in a prison like Jack Letts, or in one of the Kurdish camps. You know, and with the case of Jack Letts, he was perhaps one of the most high-profile British nationals who was out there, partly because of his background. I think he had been written about a lot in the newspapers.
And a middle-class boy.
Absolutely, and you know, right or wrong, he had been written about, I think, because part of his background.
So he broke the mould in a sense. He wasn't born a Muslim.
No, he was a convert. He was from Oxford. His dad was an organic farmer. I mean, these sorts of characteristics are part of why he was written about so much. We went out to find him. We had made requests over the course of several months, and you know, the way it happens is it all happens very, very quickly. We get a call once we're out there. We had the previous day interview.
So what, you flew to Damascus, did you? Or?
We flew to Erbil.
Okay.
So we fly to Erbil in Iraq, and then a 3-hour journey to the border with Syria. There you wait. There are lots of cups of tea. There are lots of documents that are being searched. There are permissions that are being checked. Lots of passports being looked at. That is a process that took maybe 3 or 4 hours or so. Lots of
courtesies to be
absolutely, and with good reason, because you know, it is a privilege and an honour to be allowed into that territory to report on what's going on, and you are the guests of Kurdish officials.
And you have local fixers with you, people
so we have
who know
local
the
people
system.
on the ground, and we of course have colleagues back here at ITN who are trying to help clear the path for us back here remotely from London.
Well, I remember in one of the editorial meetings we were saying, well, how's Rohit getting on? They said he's drinking a lot of tea.
Yeah, there was a lot of tea.
A lot of tea was drunk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a great deal of tea. But you know that is the way it's done. That is the way business is done. And you know, this is partly not entirely about journalism, but it's also about, I guess, sort of negotiation and diplomacy. I mean, so you spent some time making a case for, you know, why we should be granted an interview, and then what happens is when it is granted, you know, there's a lot that goes into the discussion about consent, about the conditions. We observe a lot about the way that somebody is being kept and treated, and clearly we cannot see everything. We, you know, we were not allowed into the prison cell where Jack Letts was being kept.
And remind us, how long has he been held?
He has been held, I think, for 2 years. He's one of the longest serving foreign prisoners in that detention centre, where we interviewed him. And it was in the prison itself where we had that conversation. We got a phone call and were told to go there quickly. We met some Kurdish officials. We followed them around in a car, in a few circles for a while, and then eventually to the prison. We're shown into a room.
And presumably you mustn't reveal anything about where the prison is, and you have to observe all the security.
Yeah, absolutely,
and
yeah.
so on.
I mean, that's part of the arrangement.
Yeah.
But, you know, once we did that, we're sitting in a room. We have our camera set up. The lights are out. The producer and the cameraman who I was working with were ready. And then, you know, with no notice at all, Jack Letts is led by a guard in a balaclava into the room, and it's quite a remarkable thing to be sitting there where we were to have this conversation with somebody who, you know, you've reported on from afar for so many years. It's the same experience with Shamima Begum. You know, these are familiar people. You know, we
all know their names so
we all know their names, and for those of us who've been covering the story from thousands of miles away, it's quite odd to sort of sit there across a room with somebody you almost feel that you know, except of course you don't know, and your quest in that period, that allotted time slot to conduct that interview, is to try and find out who they are. You know, that's what the job is.
To break through almost this kind of almost perverse sort of anti-celebrity, isn't it?
Yes,
it's a weird
precisely.
fame that they've got.
Precisely.
Notoriety, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real notoriety, and there are a great deal of similarities between the cases of Shamima Begum and Jack Letts. You know, they're from very different backgrounds, but there are quite a few common themes that go through their cases. Of course, the big difference is that Jack Letts has not been stripped of his UK citizenship yet, and look, we don't know why that is, and government officials don't talk about individual cases. I mean, obviously there is a legal case relating to his parents that is ongoing, and it's possible that is part of the reason. But, you know, how did I find him? I mean, yeah, in many ways he seemed to be naive, but in many ways he, much like Shamima Begum, seemed to be fairly in control. I think the difference between the two of them is that Jack Letts had been in that situation. He had been in prison for much longer than Shamima Begum, who had only been in a camp for a few weeks, and so I think perhaps they had quite different perspectives, quite different outlooks.
So he's been in prison for a couple of years. His perspective is different to Shamima Begum's, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really clear. And, you know, what's interesting is that these people who have been inside ISIS, you know, they go in with this truly sort of tribal, almost communal mentality in which the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, is everything. You know, in some ways they're in similar conditions now, in that they are alongside absolutely like-minded people, except the people who the sort of guardians of that ideology are no longer in control of their circumstances.
When you went out there, when you go out there, do you feel personally threatened? Is it an unnerving environment to be in?
It's not like walking around central London, but
No.
it's not, you know, it's not, you know, the conditions of the areas where we were in were relatively stable, and so you feel largely safe for most of the time, although you're not roaming around, you're not wandering the streets, and so obviously it's a kind of alien set of circumstances.
And you're accompanied, aren't you? Very much supervised.
Yeah, and so we have people with us. You know, we travelled with a team of 3. We have a driver. We have you know, what we call a fixer. But you know, I sometimes think that's sort of a great word. You know, these are local people who
have enormous knowledge, don't they?
Enormous knowledge, who are fantastic journalists and who help us on trips like this. You know, not just from the most important editorial decisions, but some of the basic logistics. So, for example, we broke the story the night before we presented Shamima Begum with that letter of her being stripped of her citizenship. We had the letter as News at 10 goes off air, so just after midnight local time. You know, our challenge really is to find a way to print off that letter.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if she
So you got it in email form?
We got it in an email form,
Yeah.
and we decide that if she is happy to grant an interview and is happy to learn the information that we have for her, you know, it would make sense to show her that letter in physical form. And so, you know, whether it's finding a colour printer in the middle of nowhere in northeast Syria, or performing some of the most important editorial tasks, you know, behind a trip like that. You know, the key to an assignment like that are really the people on the ground, the local people who we trust to go out there and to travel with, to work with, to live alongside those people while we're on the ground.
So in territorial terms, ISIS is finished.
Yeah.
But do you, in any sense, feel that ISIS is finished as an ideological movement?
No, absolutely not. And, you know, everyone who knows about this movement is absolutely clear about this. We were with the head of Interpol last week, who said that actually the challenge posed by ISIS will actually grow now that there is no physical caliphate.
Because it's sort of fragmented.
Absolutely.
Almost, isn't it?
They say they're going to now be fighting on 5 fronts, including obviously people who return home to their home countries who still pose a threat. They're talking about guerrilla tactics still being used in Syria and Iraq. They're talking too about people, fighters who will go to other countries, to emerging war zones, Southeast Asia, in Africa as well, you know, who might try and, you know, join conflicts elsewhere. So all eyes are on these different hotspots around the world to try and work out where the new caliphate will be.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We'll be talking more about this. Rohit, thank you so much.